Hey, greetings, folks. Welcome to another edition of Adventures in Imperfect Living. My name is Greg Willits from RosaryArmy.com.
And I'm Jennifer Willits, his wife.
Got a great show coming up for you. I had my bio for our guest over here on this computer, and then I closed it, and then now it's over there. But I don't need notes to tell you about this. This is a guy that I worked with years ago. His name is Dr. Jared Staudt. Had the opportunity to work with him in the Archdiocese of Denver when we were still living out there, and he was an incredibly smart guy there. I remember when we were able to get him into the office that I was running at the time, the Office of Evangelization and Family Life Ministries. It felt like a win. It's like getting. I hired a dude who was a doctor.
He has
PhD.
a PhD in systematic theology.
Yeah.
Systematic theology. I had to look that up.
How to do it?
Like what it is exactly.
To study the study of God. But to do it with a very particular way of going about doing it, right? It's just systematically.
Well, that's sure. But I guess if I could just define it for you, and I'm happy to do that, it's very much an approach of asking the big, broad question is, how is the Bible as a whole speaking to my life today? So let's take a deeper dive into what all the scriptures may say about a particular teaching. So it's like a holistic approach about making it applicable to one's life right now. So that's kind of like a really big overview of it. But it is very much an approach to understanding scripture. And he is a very smart man.
But what we talk about today is, well, scripture comes up, isn't necessarily scripture, but it's his newest book. It's called How the Eucharist Can Save Civilization. If you ever find yourself looking at the news or going online and saying, "Oh, Jesus, please come today. Just be here. Just wipe us all out right now and bring us to heaven."
So what Jared would say is, he is here. He's in our tabernacles. He's in Mass. And so there's the half glass empty, half glass full approach, but it's a very riveting conversation about the Eucharist. And hopefully you are going to come away with a new appreciation of how you can live a more Eucharistic life.
His website is buildingcatholicculture.com, where you can find more of his writings and his posts, and even invite him to come speak at your parish. He does a lot of retreats and pilgrimages and that kind of thing as well. Just a super nice, super smart guy, and he likes beer. We didn't get to talk about beer.
Aw.
He's written a book about that as well. So we think you're really going to get a lot out of, and hopefully be inspired to go even more deeply in your faith. If you feel like you're struggling, if you feel like something's missing, it might be that you need more Jesus, and that Jesus can be found, and that Jesus is available to you in the Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity, as we talk about with Dr. Jared Staudt, his latest book, How the Eucharist Can Save Civilization. So, Jared, it's always nice to catch up with someone who we've known, IRL in real life, and you and I actually had a chance to work together out in Denver, which was I was trying to remember when you joined the Office of Evangelization Family Life Ministries. How soon after you joined did I leave? Because I feel like we worked together for at least a half a year, but I honestly couldn't remember how long it was.
I joined the office at the beginning of May 2016. And so I think you left by, the end of the summer?
No. If you joined in May of 2016?
Yeah.
Then I abandoned you like a month later. It was like as I was hiring
ships passing in the night.
Wow.
That's really funny. So I was interviewing you for that position as I was
leaving.
As I knew, wow, I'd already had 2 main interviews and flown out of the state for those before. Well, I feel bad, but so you went from being in the Office of Evangelization and Family Life Ministries, and you were helping with our curriculum for restored order stuff and helping families get up to speed on that. But then your trajectory went kind of all over the place in Denver, because you were in Denver before you came to work at the Archdiocese. You left. I believe you went to Wyoming Catholic College, didn't you? Is that where you went?
No, I was at the University of Mary in North Dakota.
Oh, in North Dakota.
I taught at the Weston Institute for 5 years.
That's right.
I went up to UMary for 2 years, and then came back to work for the Archdiocese of Denver, and then got reconnected to the AI part-time.
Yeah.
But so after 1 year, I began working both in catechesis and also in Catholic schools in formation. So I was doing formation for catechists, formation for teachers. But then I switched over to be full-time in Catholic schools. And so for 4.5 years,
wow.
I worked in solely the Catholic schools office.
What were you doing in the Catholic schools office?
I became the associate superintendent for mission information. So just trying to help our schools to embrace the faith more deeply in the curriculum, and then just to do a lot of trainings for teachers.
Oh, that seems like that would have been a really good fit for you. I mean, because that's where your heart always lies. I mean, education, it really seems that was at the heart of everything that when you and I spoke, that's what you were trying to do, was how do we educate people in the faith, and with your background, with your PhD, and you got that from Ave Maria, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right.
So you've been all over the country.
Systematic theology.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been a DRE in a couple of parishes, and then even at the Augustine Institute, I was teaching catechesis there. My background was in Catholic studies before I got my PhD. And so up at UMary, I was doing that and forming a lot of school teachers. So education in any sense, right, in the church has really been at the center of what I've been doing, just in different capacities. And even now, so back in December, I took a job with Exodus 90, and this is formation for men, just learning how to pray, how to enter into the Christian life more deeply. So there's many different ways of being in education, and I've certainly tried a lot of different ways.
I have recommendations if you want some not critique, but some advice for Exodus 90. Are you open to that?
Please.
So since you said you're leading like their educational resources there. I went through Exodus 90 about 4 years ago, and one of the things that bothered me about it, and I always come from the perspective if it bothers me, no, she's got to look of it. She's worried. Don't be worried, because this is actually a positive. This is a positive.
Okay, good.
I think that the way it was written, at least 4 years ago, and I haven't looked at it again, was the cold showers, the recommended cold showers. The way it was positioned was to help with chastity in a way, sort of like calm you down a little bit. And that just wasn't an issue for me. It's like it was we're at a point in our lives where, we're past having children just biologically. And it was one of those things where I missed the mental connection of why should I continue to do it? And yes, I could offer it up, but even understanding different ways of offering it up. And so I say this because cold showers, ironically, became something of a part of my life earlier this year. That something clicked, and I'm like, why didn't I know that's the way I could have approached it when I did Exodus 90? I wouldn't have been so angry about it every time, or so bitter, right? Because I just kept thinking in Exodus 90, they said it's for, I can't remember the exact reason why.
For your purity, sexual purity.
Yeah, that's what it was. It was sexual purity, because it was almost like they were addressing it for men outside of marriage. That's what it was. It felt like, it's like, but I'm married. I don't, it's, okay. But at the beginning of this year, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's a guy on YouTube, and he talks a lot about neuroscience and that kind of thing. But he positioned it as a way for increasing endorphins, particularly for people like me that tend to go really negative mentally. That if I struggle with mental health and I don't tend to have really positive dopamine rushes, it's hard for me to generate dopamine. That's actually a way of doing it. And when I started doing it for that reason, and then here's where I'm going with the Catholic side of things. Mm-hmm. Once I started doing it just for a physical benefit, then I started to see the opportunity to offer it up truly in an amazing way. And I started to see Jesus on the cross. Now, I was doing this during Lent. I started to see Christ on the cross and him being lashed beforehand at the agony in the garden, the scourging of the pillar. And when that cold water hits you, it's like 1,000 lashes. And it was it became like this offering in a way that I'm like, that's what I wish I had. I didn't have the mental wherewithal 4 years ago when I did Exodus 90. But it was that connection. It gave it, sometimes that understanding the redemptive nature of our suffering is a hard thing for some people like me to connect to and to comprehend. Anyway, I throw that out there because that's what in the back of my head I've always I wish the Exodus 90 guys would look at it this way. And but it took me 4 years to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful. There's many things I could say in relation to that, but one big one, like you said, maybe back in the day it did appear that this was being written for single men, but I think what we've seen through the years is that our primary demographic is actually married men between 30 and 50. And so I think that has come out more in the way that things are being presented, to the point now that young single guys are like, hey, are you forgetting about us? Now,
what about
so
my
we
cold
almost have
showers?
another problem there. But, one of the most common critiques I've seen of Exodus is that, well, you guys are almost like sadistic. You're just doing all these hard things, because they're hard.
Yeah.
And actually, getting into this now full time, I've been writing for them for years, but getting into it full time, I don't see that, anywhere. I think guys have that in their mentality. Like, we just need to do all these hard things. But, it really is rooted in prayer, that the daily holy hour is the heart. And also the fact that you have to do it in fraternity. I tell guys that, just doing the disciplines in and of themselves is absolutely not enough. Because some guys say, is this Pelagian? Well, what you're doing is taking on all these practices, but it's rooted in the holy hour, and it has to be done in fraternity, for it really to be Exodus 90. And in that setting, I think what we see is that the cold shower can take on a different character of more of a self-offering. Because part of the difficulty is that men like challenges, but on the other hand, we are so used to being comfortable. And so the fasting and cold showers are really, I think, meant to inspire us to just be more self-sacrificial and to give our lives. And one of the things that we see is that for those men who do struggle with sexual purity, it's not just attacking that head on in isolation, but that growing in that self-sacrificial discipline in other areas.
Yeah.
So obviously technology, but food, but even just something like a cold shower that can really help more holistically to grow in discipline and virtue. So anyway, we could talk more about that.
We really could.
Those are some initial thoughts,
there are lots of things about it that it's one of those things where there are benefits, but there's obvious struggles. And but I was excited when I read that you were doing that and working with them, because I think that focus on continuous improvement and figuring out how to do it, there's something missing. I would say, I'll add another thing, the fraternity, as you said, is really important. But then, and again, I approach everything so selfishly. For someone like me that struggles with fraternity, that struggles with those small groups, those are the things that I tend to run away from. And quite honestly, that was one of the things that made me give up on Exodus 90, was I couldn't keep up with that small group. I constantly felt like I wasn't what I was supposed to be or doing what I was supposed to do. That's another area that I think would be of great service. And ironically, providentially, I see a connection between the work that you're doing with Exodus 90 and your book, which is the reason why we wanted to have you on the program, which is to talk about how the Eucharist can save civilization, because you were talking about that holy hour and that time with Jesus really is going to be so transformative in the lives of men who go through Exodus 90. It certainly was for me. I was blessed to be in a position where I could actually go to a church that had an open chapel during the day and 5 days a week had adoration and spend that holy hour with Jesus. And it was such a huge blessing. Let's talk about the book, because we see so many people struggling with the things that I talked about, right? Just being more of a Christian, being more of a Catholic, of living it out, of going deeper, of going through the struggles of the things that we need to do better. Just reading Liturgy of the Hours this morning, again, of all the things that St. Paul and St. Peter tell us, you have to make all these sacrifices and be willing to die. And I'm going, and I'm nowhere close to that. It's just like, I know I need to, but I'm not there. How can the Eucharist bring us to that? And we need to talk about this. So let's start talking about, in the book, one of the things right out of the gate that is brought up is the idea of immortality. So let's kind of take this piece by piece. Let's talk about immortality, because you think about, well, I know what immortality means. It means I'm going to live forever. It means, let's talk about what it really is and sort of the way that the world might see it. At the beginning of the book, and Joseph Pierce talked about it in the forward a little bit. Can you talk about what is immortality? Why do we need to be concerned about that in a world that is so focused right now on the right now?
Well, what's interesting is that you have all of these transhumanists who want immortality in this world, which to me sounds a lot like hell. You know what I mean? If you were just kind of like trapped here forever in this current life, I mean, I don't think that that's actually a very good thing, because the immortality that we seek is something better than this. Because in this life, we're always grasping after finite things, right? And so even to continue life as we know it now would be to continue things from our own finite and limited perspective. But Jesus puts out immortality as actually a goal of the Eucharist. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood, he will never die. And even if he does die, he will live, right?
Yeah.
Because I will raise him up on the last day. And so he says, yeah, if you eat my flesh, you will be immortal. But the kind of immortality that he's going to give us is according to his own life, his own divine life, that he wants us to become him. And I was even thinking about this in terms of the fraternity and the holy hour and how these things fit together. What does Jesus really want, right? In the Eucharist, he gives us everything, like literally, right? He gives us his own flesh and blood, his human soul, but his divinity. He gives us his divine spirit to dwell in us. And what does he want back from us? Everything. And that's actually a big part of the problem. Like you said, we're afraid to make these sacrifices. We view sacrifices negative, right? Like I'm giving something up. I'm losing it, essentially. I'm losing it. But Jesus says, well, if you lose it, you'll gain it, And so we do have to lose our lives so that we can gain them. And so the death that we experience in this life is actually a gaining. It is a coming to life in Christ. And, I think that a big problem in terms of immortality is that, some people are afraid of it. Say, well, sitting up on a cloud, with a harp, just strumming along, like that sounds very boring, right? Because we do think of it as just a continuation of time as we know it in this life.
Yeah.
But immortality through the Eucharist is entering into Christ. That Jesus says, just as the Father is in me, so I am in the Father, and so I will be in you. It's like, that should just blow your mind. Explosion, It's like the unity that he has with the Father, the oneness, the communion, the perfect happiness of love. He wants us to enter into that as well. And that is what immortality really is, a whole different life in Christ.
You mentioned at the beginning of your explanation of immortality, you threw out that word transhumanism. In today's day and age, I think some people listening might immediately think that you mean one thing when you say transhumanism, when the definition of it is kind of different. What is transhumanism? How would you define that to someone or explain that to someone?
Yeah. So it's interesting, I was talking about the goal of the Eucharist is to become Christ, right? Not to imitate Christ, not to exist alongside of him, but to be one with him. That's to have communion with him. What we want to do, and you can even look going back to, like Lord Bacon at the beginning of the scientific revolution, or even Descartes, they threw out the goal of the modern scientific revolution as overcoming death. And in a way, that is trying to recreate humanity through our own power. And the way that has morphed now in our own culture is through something called transhumanism. How will we overcome death? How will we recreate humanity? Well, it's actually going to be through the power of genetics, that we can now manipulate human DNA. I mean, we do crazy stuff. I mean, this is already happening, even trying to fuse human DNA with animal DNA to create what we call chimeras. But, could we make human beings taller, stronger, smarter? Could we overcome old age and disease simply through genetic manipulation? And so this effort to recreate humanity, I would say, in our own image, that is into our own projection of power and of what we would like to be, which I think goes all the way back to the fall. You will be like God because you yourself, right? Well, you will know for yourself what is good and evil. And I think that is what really lurks behind transhumanism. You will gain immortality for yourself. You're not going to receive it in communion with God. You're going to grasp after it and take control of it. You will be masters of human nature.
Going back to the forward and defining some of these words so that we can continue with the conversation. If we're going to talk about how the Eucharist can save civilization, we oftentimes say things like, civilization is going to hell in a handbasket. We're seeing the end of modern civilization. Joseph Pierce in the forward, he suggested that we actually define what is civilization so that we can know well, what is it that the Eucharist can actually save? What is civilization supposed to be? One of the the definitions, the simple definitions that he gave in the foreword: true civilization is a culture animated by a transcendental trinity of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Maybe if you could dive into that idea of defining civilization a little bit.
Yeah, well, just even to take a step back farther, because part of that definition was culture, right? And so human beings, no matter what, live within a culture, unless you're like raised by wolves or something like that. But apart from that, we group ourselves together. And Aristotle says it's because, we're not self-sufficient as individuals, no matter how we try to fool ourselves to say that we are. We're not, right? And so culture is a shared way of life that we have with others. And in the book, I lay out, kind of 4 principles of culture. A group of people living in a particular place with shared practices that are guided by shared beliefs and aspirations, right? So that is what a culture ultimately is. Now, what's a civilization? Well, in a more technical sense, right, it is when a culture gets to a particular level of sophistication. And the word civilization comes from the Latin word for city, civis, and so civilization is when you get to the higher forms of social organization built with urbanization and higher levels of politics and education and these kinds of things. What Joseph Pearce is saying is that we can essentially judge a civilization, right? Because civilization and culture as well aim at the perfection of humanity. That is why we join together. There's certain human goods that we cannot achieve on our own. And so we try to achieve these goods with other people. That's why we say society aims at the common good. And that in our culture, we try to reduce those to, like health and wellness and economic prosperity. If you were to ask the average American, those are the things they're going to put out, like, this is what our country is for, right, to achieve these ends.
That's
and
the
Joseph
American
Pearce,
dream,
I think, is
right?
saying we're trying to achieve higher ends.
Yeah.
And so when people say, when will civilization collapse? I say, it already has, you know what I mean? Because, we are still going strong on some levels, right, on a material level. But if we judge a culture or civilization by achieving the true human goods, right, we are not doing that. We're actually undermining those goods, even on a basic level, like the defense of human life, but on a higher level as well, that is coming to truth, goodness, and beauty, which ultimately are found in God.
Wow.
Yeah, so many things.
Just want to speak about that, the comment about civilization and the collapse. Recently, I'm an assistant teacher at a Catholic classical education school, and so we were going through some elements of world history and ancient civilizations and discussing the fall of Rome. And the teacher pointed out, to the average Roman in the 400s, if you were to ask them, so what was the fall like? To live through the fall, they didn't even know it fell. They're just like, what? They couldn't see it because to them, life just continued on, and they still identified as Romans even long after. Like, you can't really see it when you're in it. You need the passage of centuries, and then you look back like, oh, that's kind of where things started to fracture recognizably. We can see the evidence of that. And so, the question was naturally raised with a discussion with the students, like, well, what about this civilization in
1968. There's your date. So 476 is when we say the Roman Empire collapsed. But it's true. Saint Benedict was born in 480, a noble Roman family, and they just kept going. They sent him to Rome for his education as if nothing had happened. So you're right. Mm-hmm. And we're just still going like nothing happened. But I'll tell you what, 1,000 years from now, they'll be like, oh, 1968. Yeah, that's the year that's Western civilization started going down the drain.
So why do you fixate on 1968 in particular? I mean, I definitely sense it in the 60s. And there were many significant events in different years of the 60s. But why 68 to you?
And from a Catholic perspective, it's the year of Humanae Vitae. Mm-hmm. And so, you kind of see that flashpoint, but it's also the year of the student uprisings. And so that the student uprisings were seen as a kind of cultural catalyst, where the students took over universities, and it was the sense that the younger generation was kind of coming into its own and pushing this new view. That was accompanied by massive Vietnam War protests in the United States. And then it was the year of major assassinations. So Martin Luther King Jr., which sparked race riots, and then, Robert Kennedy. So there was just something about that year that really was a major flashpoint and turning point.
When you think about it now, with 1968 being such a critical time where with the student uprisings and everything, and now you look at the university systems that seem to be just far beyond worse than they were back in 68. How bad could things get, right? I mean, that's kind of the question that we find ourselves. We look around and go, well, I mean, I suppose it can get even worse. We read about Sodom and Gomorrah in Scripture. It's like, well, they're not quite there. They're pretty there, but they're not quite there. But
like, how far is the downward spiral?
Yeah, and so if we're gonna, let's pull it back to the book. If the Eucharist can save civilization, can the Eucharist save a civilization that at times feels like it's beyond a turning point? Mm-hmm. Is it possible that we're supposed to let everything collapse and the Eucharist will save some other civilization? Because there's been other civilizations before this one, right? And so we find ourselves thinking about this. And one of the things you talk about in the book, talking about the greatest civilizations in history are striving for immortality, and how they've gone about doing that. Why are they, number one, why are they striving for immortality, those greatest civilizations? And when we think about transhumanism, is that what they're trying to do now, striving for immortality? And is it just the wrong immortality that they're striving for, I guess? It's a bunch of questions all mixed up in there.
Well, yeah, I mean, many profound questions in there. But, one thing about how bad things can get, I think it's interesting to think about this. The students who led those protests in 1968 are now running the world. That's literally true, right? When you think of how old they were in college and where they're at now. So they're literally our political leaders. They're literally now in charge of the universities, et cetera, throughout Europe and the United States and beyond. So in a way, they're seeing things through. And it's very interesting to look at the cultural revolution that began in the 60s and the whole trajectory, because, there was a flashpoint in the 60s and, things kind of petered out. And then all of a sudden, you even look, the last 10 years, things picked up again. Well, why is that?
Yeah.
In a way, it's because the 60s generation has come into its own. They're now running the world.
Jared, when you said that, it's like, I have a knowing of that fact, right? But I don't know if I've heard it just said as bluntly. I actually just had, when you said that, I had like an emotional, like almost like a tear response. It's such a sad fact, a sad truth that you just said, that it gave me an emotional response when
Say
you said
it again.
Well, no, don't make me cry, man. It's like
I want to hear it again.
It's the fact that the people that started this are the people that are now running it.
Oh, yeah.
They're seeing it through. And in a way, they're seeing how far they can get before they die, right?
And I think the emotional response that I just had was fear. I mean, there was a fear response that just came out.
Well, I would like to respond to that because I sense there is a new revolution occurring in the traditional realm, a new movement of this age of 20-something, these young families who are saying enough. We're going to see something new through. I'm going to find a TLM anywhere that I can, and I'm going to go and I'm going to support that.
Or just a parish that's a lot more reverent, right? If you don't have a TLM available.
But there is this, and the people who are in the TLM they're talking about the restoration of Christian culture. And I'm sure you know who I'm referring to when I mention that piece of writing by John Senior. And so this is all just bubbling up all of a sudden. Or at least I'm just now becoming aware of it. I mean, I don't know when, but okay. I know there's lots of things to comment on.
Let me speak of that. There's still some great questions I didn't get to from the previous one, but let me speak into that first. My conversion was in 1995. And I was actually kicked out of the public schools in 7th grade, and only the Catholic school would take me in. I was a non-practicing Catholic. And, in 1 year of my conversion, I mean, this is kind of nuts, but I read St. Faustina's Diary, Crossing the Threshold of Hope by John Paul II, the Bible, St. Teresa's Story of a Soul, and then I began reading the Catechism, right? And I was confirmed and all in that year. But then I started reading even church history, the lives of the saints in church history the next year. Okay, why do I say that? Because I became super well informed at a young age very quickly. And I even started going to the traditional Latin Mass. That was 1996 when I went to my first Latin Mass. Where was it? One Saturday a month at the Catholic high school across the river in a chapel where you could fit 10 people, right? But I also started going to the Byzantine liturgy, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom at a Ruthenian parish. I became their main altar server actually at that parish. So I became immersed in the tradition very quickly. And the reason why this is relevant is I started looking around and saying, what in the world happened? Okay, I'm 15 years old at this point in 1996. I've read church history. I've read, the lives of the saints. I've done the De Montfort consecration that we were talking about before the show started. I've immersed myself in the Latin Mass and the Byzantine liturgy. I see what's going on in my parish, and I was leading a Divine Mercy Holy Hour, and I retrained all the altar servers and led a whole liturgical renewal in my parish. And anyway, I mean, it's kind of crazy stuff.
At 15.
At 15?
At 15.
Yeah.
What?
But then you start looking around and saying, okay, but the seminaries in the 90s still, they were teaching heresy and Catholic education. I mean, where could you find anything, the liturgy was pretty awful. And, I just think that the priests were pretty demoralized, whatever. But this was the time of John Paul II. And so I feel like, young people my age latched on to what he was doing. And when I look back now over the last 27, 28 years since then, it's amazing to see how far we've come because, you were talking about, that you're teaching part-time at a classical school. How many parochial classical schools were there then?
None.
Zero.
Yeah.
Zero. And actually, my own kids' parochial school was the second parochial classical school in the country. And that started back in 2011. So, I mean, that we weren't even close to that.
Wasn't even close.
Not even close, right? And so the seminaries have gone through a great renewal. Not that they're perfect or anything, but they're so much better than they were in 1995. So much better, right? Catholic education is so much better. Even there were some really good colleges that had started back then. You had Thomas Aquinas College, you had Christendom, but they were really isolated. Ave Maria hadn't been founded yet, 1995, or maybe it was just happening. But then since then, you've had the renewal of University of Mary, Benedictine College. You see all these things happening. So I think it's good to point that out, Jennifer, like you're doing that. Even though the 60s generation is having its moment, right, in charge of kind of the national and global structures of politics and economics and whatever, in the meantime, you do have this younger generation coming along of, really, I think, rediscovering the tradition and rediscovering what education really is about, rediscovering the liturgy.
And rediscovering the Eucharist.
Absolutely.
Eucharistic reverence.
when you even think of like Eucharistic adoration, that's actually one of the greatest things that's happened in the last 25 years.
Yeah, I agree.
Because, 27, 28 years ago during my conversion, there were some isolated adoration chapels here and there, but that's exploded since then.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the power. And I know there's some dioceses who kept track of what has happened even to vocations in their diocese after they embrace Eucharistic adoration.
Well, we're the Archdiocese of Atlanta, right? And we talked about this for years and years. One of the best fruits of this was Archbishop John Francis Donahue. When he became Archbishop of Atlanta, he said that the Eucharist is going to be our focus, and initiated Eucharistic adoration at the cathedral and took one of the first hours. And so, certain time of the week, you go into when he was alive.
Was this in the 90s?
Well, I can't remember exactly when he became Archbishop, but this would have been in the late 90s when he really started pushing it in Atlanta. But you'd walk into the Eucharistic chapel down at the cathedral, and he'd be in there at a certain time. But then he started the Eucharistic Congress in Atlanta, and that was a transformative thing for everything that we've been doing for all these years, is that focus on the Eucharist, and to go to this event that would happen every year, and 20 to 30,000 Catholics were joining together and on their knees in front of the Eucharist. And it was such a learning thing for us, because for me, growing up, Jennifer and I were born 2 years after 1968. So we were born in the midst of this stupidity, in the church. And I remember very clearly, I had not yet received my first communion, but I remember the Mass where the priest explained how everyone was going to start receiving the Eucharist in the hand. And this is the same priest that had us on Palm Sunday passed out streamers as we were walking into Mass, so that at one point in the Mass we could throw streamers. And so I'm moving around a lot, going to all these different parishes, and I've said this a zillion times on our shows. It wasn't until Jennifer and I got married in '95, by the way. And so, and her conversion happened in the first few years of our marriage, and she came into full communion of the church in '99. In those first few years of just trying to understand what the heck had I received? It wasn't until we'd been married for 2 or 3 years and we're starting to try to understand how to bring Jesus more into our marriage and our family that I had the opportunity to go to Eucharistic adoration for the first time. For the first time, I was like 29 years old. It had never been introduced. It had never been explained. It had never been offered in all of the parishes I'd attended in multiple states and on the east side of the United States. And I get really angry about it. Right, I feel like something was denied me. I lived in Ohio, both in Columbus and Cincinnati, for 11 years of my growing up years. Never once heard of Steubenville University. In all the years I was in college, never once heard of it, and it was right there. So yes, thank God our children are having access to these things, but for someone of our age, it oftentimes feels like we're not ever going to get to see
this is
the saving.
One of the proofs of the indefectibility of the church is that we did everything that we could do to kill it. And yet here we are, right? The Eucharist is bringing about renewal.
Fair point.
And to go back to a really good question you asked, like, will the Eucharist actually renew this civilization? Will it be a different civilization? We mentioned the fall of Rome, and I think it's important to point out in relation to the title of my book, because some people think it's overly pious. The Eucharist did save civilization before, right? After the fall of Rome in the West, the new civilization of Christendom was built up around the altar. And even, when you think of the universities, hospitals, even all of the great arts and music that we love, it all grew up around the altar. And so, yes, the Eucharist can do that. If the Eucharist can't do that, what can? Right? So civilization is not beyond saving, but I think at the same time, it could be true that this civilization will collapse. I mean, when the editors at TAN said, do you want to name the book, the Eucharist will save civilization? I said, no.
Can it?
Let's name it Can Save Civilization.
Yeah.
In the last chapter of the book, I say that I am very confident that the Lord will renew civilization. It may not be our civilization, right? If he does not come again first, I do think that we will see a new Christian civilization, because the Eucharist simply renews our culture. That's what it does. It changes us, and we begin changing what is around us. And it does have a cumulative effect, a kind of ripple effect that builds up into society and into civilization. Now, it may not happen in this civilization, because there is a principle that Philip Jenkins puts out in his book, The Next Christendom, that God goes where he is wanted. And so Christendom may reemerge in Africa, it may reemerge in Latin America, or it may emerge in China, of all places. And when it does so, I think that we will see continuity with Western civilization, because one of the characteristics of Western civilization, ironically, is that it's universal, in the sense that it articulates universal principles that are accessible to any culture and any civilization. That's one of the things that makes it unique. And so I do think that our whole history, our whole tradition will continue, but it may continue in a very different way.
Okay, I have to ask this question because we have been discussing these very large themes, and our listeners might be thinking, well, I'm just me. I'm just this one person. I'm a single mom. I don't even have any children. Like what can the individual do to participate in this restoration, in this salvific mission that we are called to as Catholics? What does that look like?
Well, if culture is a shared way of life, as we were discussing earlier, we are called to live a Eucharistic culture. That is a Eucharistic way of life. And in the last section of the book, I kind of lay out some principles for this. And the first is that the Eucharist should shape our time. That the Eucharist is not meant to be 1 hour of our week. No, right? And we were talking about adoration. That really, I think, through prayer, that every day we should be making at least a spiritual communion if we're not making it to Mass every day. And that the whole week is centered around the Eucharist, that the week both builds up to and flows from the Eucharist. That it really is that climax, and that Sunday truly is the Lord's day. And that the Eucharist shapes the year insofar as we're living the liturgical seasons. Mm-hmm. The Eucharist is also meant to shape space, that our parish really should be the geographic center of where we live, and that the parish should be a beautiful sign of the Lord's presence. Even think of the steeple and the bells, right? This is all meant to announce the Lord is here, right? And then processions actually extend that presence into the surrounding neighborhoods to say, here is the King. Come and see him, come and meet him. And then even going on pilgrimages, right? You don't have to go on a pilgrimage to encounter the Lord, but it is a way of renewing your encounter with Jesus in the Eucharist. Because even if you're going to, say, the Holy Land, or you're going to Rome, the Mass will most likely be the center of that pilgrimage experience. But that the Eucharist should also begin to shape our relationships. The Eucharist itself is marital. We become one flesh with the Lord. He's giving himself completely to us. We're receiving this gift. We're giving ourselves back to him. And that should shape not only our marriages, right, so that our marriages become Eucharistic, but actually how we interact with everyone, that we are able to make our lives a Eucharistic gift for others. And Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about discerning the body, and essentially says there's two ways of discerning the body. One is, he says, do you not know that that the bread is a communion, a participation in the body of Christ? But he also talks about attending to those who are there at the Eucharistic gathering. That's the name, what the church means, the gathering, the assembly. And he basically says that if you are overlooking the presence of Christ in others, you're also not discerning the body, right? And he connects these two ways of seeing Christ in the world. And Jesus himself said that, when you did this to the least of my brothers, you did it to me. So we can't try to live a Eucharistic life only through the sacrament. We have to also live a Eucharistic life by finding Jesus in the world itself, and then becoming a tabernacle of his presence in the world.
When we talk about the ways that we can live out the Eucharist in our lives, and again, this comes from a very negative, jaded perspective of Greg Willits. The talk of Eucharistic revival right now in the United States, and having the National Eucharistic Congress, many of these things coming on the coattails of additional scandal in the church, that the poor way that things were dealt with, Theodore McCarrick and things like that, and frustrations in the church, and then suddenly all of these things are like, well, let's do this thing, and it feels like it's sort of a sleight of hand at times, of like, let's focus on this, let's distract them. They're saying that they want this. Let's give them a little bit of this. While meanwhile, things just seem to be still falling apart even within the church. And so again, very negative way of looking at it, and I acknowledge that. The idea of all these things that are going on, I'm slowly starting to come around that maybe some good is happening here, and that it's not just the sleight of hand. What have been your thoughts on the talk of Eucharistic revival? And maybe it's just because I feel like I've been burnt enough times by Hope in the church and things that they were doing, and then it just became another program, right? And you and I have worked on an archdiocesan level where we create programs, and then we make another program, and as soon as that program is done, we create another program. And after a while, it's sort of like, are we making any difference? Because we're seeing what's happening with civilization. Is this going to make a difference? This Eucharistic revival movement that we're seeing right now?
Well, to go back to the title of the book,
yeah,
it can make a difference.
No, Darren. I need to know, will it? I need to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, to look at your name, will it?
Exactly.
Will it happen? No, anyway. So I would say that it could vary even on a parish by parish basis, right? And so if a parish were to say, well, the U.S. bishops are doing a revival, well, then, forget about it, right? But insofar as the U.S. bishops are calling all of us to a Eucharistic revival, that is a good thing.
Yeah.
And so just relying on one event in Indianapolis, I mean, I'd say I have hopes. I know there's a lot of cynicism even about that event, but I have hopes that that could be a really profound event. Why? Because my favorite person is going to be there.
Right, exactly.
The Son of God. No, anyway.
Exactly.
Jesus in the flesh. He's going to be there, you know? I mean, so I think a lot of
Jesus
good
is
can come of
coming
that, you know?
to Indianapolis?
Why aren't they leading with that? You know, they should.
Jesus is coming.
Come and see the Lord incarnate. And so I think a lot of good can come of that. But I've actually advised some parishes of what to do. And I think that how I think that this could make a difference is that people in the pews have to come to encounter Jesus in the Eucharist in a new way. Because we take the Eucharist for granted. I mean, and that's essentially the middle section of my book. We're taking the Eucharist and the Mass for granted. And if we're just kind of coming to Mass, even like good homilies, that's great. But you know how it is. People in the pews, this is how they receive homilies, blah, 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 right? And if they don't see anything different, if they don't experience anything that is different, then nothing will be different, right? And so, you know, I think you could even have like a Eucharistic event, even just flowing directly from the Mass. Let's have, I think, really an invitation. So something a little bit more evangelical to invite people to encounter Jesus and then actually lead them into a Eucharist encounter of adoration. And then flowing from that, I think we should really talk about how the Eucharist shapes how we live. That's one of the main goals of the book, is that I say the Eucharist is not something simply to be believed. It is something to be lived. And if we're living differently because of this revival, then it will be a success. And I think that's how we can judge whether a revival has actually occurred, if we are living differently. And there's one concrete thing that, you know, I've been proposing. So let's say, for instance, that there's an invitation to people. Let's encounter the Lord now. You go into adoration. Then there's a way of unpacking that. So I'm actually going into a parish in Arkansas. I'm doing this. I'm giving more of an invitational talk. We're going into adoration where I'm trying to set that up. That's not just happening because a lot of people don't even know what it is, you know? And then afterwards, I want to unpack it to say, this is what you should take away to live differently. But then, and I insisted on this, but then I want to break bread as a community. Because in the early church, and this actually, you can see this in 1 Corinthians, the same passage when I was talking about discerning the body, is that there was something called an agape meal. You know, that is a meal of charity, which took place around the Mass. You know, and this sounds pathetic, but I think even coffee and donuts are like a teeny remnant of that. Maybe a pathetic remnant, but there's still a remnant that after breaking bread in the Eucharist, we should break bread ourselves. And even, you know, I cite this in the book, you know, there's a letter from Pliny the Younger writing back to the Emperor Trajan. He says that the Christians joined together before dawn to sing hymns to Christ as a God. Then later in the day, they gather together in their homes for an ordinary meal. Why? Because if we are the body of Christ, that also needs to be expressed socially. We need to really grow in fraternity together, right? I know, Greg, you said that was something that's difficult.
Yeah, but what if you hate people?
And there's a reason that it's difficult. We're struggling in that in our culture, in our society. That's one of the ways that we can see our culture being, you know, I think really sick, you know, and grown thin because it isn't something that draws us together in a genuine community. And we see that in our parishes. We come in for Mass and we get out of there. You know what I mean? Maybe you shake a few hands and, hey, how you doing? But our parishes are not centers of community. So I think that this is a way that we can grow and through the Eucharistic revival to have meaningful ways of having smaller communities, meals, where we're actually getting to know people. And here's the thing about community. It's living the Christian life with one another. Because we need that. Just like we said, we need culture because we're not self-sufficient. We have to achieve common goods with other people. And that is also true in the faith. And so the Eucharist draws us together for the most important thing, the sacrifice of the Mass. But that cannot remain isolated. If it does, we're living a secular life. Because the faith is separated from everything else, right? And that's a fundamental problem and why the church is in crisis. Because even if we're practicing the faith, if it's in isolation, then we are living a secular life.
The idea of getting together with the meals, it's kind of funny, you know, even though I said I struggle with the fraternity, you know, getting together in small groups and that kind of thing. the church that we've started going to in the last couple of years does exactly what you describe. After the traditional Latin Mass and before the Novus Ordo Mass, in between those two, during the school year, we were on pause for the summer, which I also appreciate, that they don't say it's like you start going to this and you're signing up for this for the rest of your life. You know, that you feel like you're making this huge commitment. But all the different ministries in the parish take turns sponsoring a breakfast, in between the masses, so that people can come together, and our priest is there, and our priest gives additional catechesis, not just to the kids, not just to the adults, but to all the families together. And so we come together, and you're like, hey, is this seat open? And it's packed. It's always packed. And it's dynamic, and it's exciting, and we look forward to it. Our 14-year-old daughter looks forward to it. We have that meal. We've gotten to know people. We've gotten to know more people at this parish in 2 years than we did at any of the other parishes that we'd attended all over the place, where we, as you described, we walked in and walked out. So it's very hopeful.
You're building Christian culture, right?
You're building Christian culture. And it's like we're doing it, but it was helpful to hear you say it, because I wasn't putting that label on there. And that's exactly what was happening. And quite honestly, going back to talking about the Eucharistic Congresses in Atlanta, for years I talked about when we'd go to these things, and there were certain people, and I can see one guy in my mind right now whose name I never knew. But every year, this old dude and I would see each other, and we'd go and we'd point at each other from across. At one of these events, one of these congresses, we talked and just made a connection. And we'd see each other, and we'd go up and we'd hug, and I'd ask how his family was. Didn't even know his name, but I knew about his family, and he'd ask about the same thing. And there was a connection. There was a connection, and the connection point was the Eucharist. So it's very exciting to hear you say those things. And one of the things that you just touched on, and it was actually a question I had written down that I wanted to ask you, the idea of the primary purpose of this book, as you said, is to show how how Catholics can live the Eucharist in their lives. And I think we've touched on a lot of these things. But I think really defining and kind of giving this as the last point that we could talk about, what does that mean for someone listening right now? What can they start doing as they're reading through your book, as they're trying to understand, if they're feeling an emotional pull off of something that was said, right? Like I did earlier. They're feeling a pull. They need to have a greater experience of Jesus in their lives, in the Eucharist. What's a step they can take as soon as they finish listening to this right now?
Yeah. So I would say that the thesis of my book is that the Eucharist should be the living center, the pulse of not only our lives, but even of society.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is clearing out what stands in the way. And so I would say, if you want to receive the Eucharist fruitfully in your lives, the first thing you should do is go to confession. If you receive the Eucharist regularly, you should receive confession regularly, because it's the best way to prepare to make a fruitful communion. Because it's an important thing, to really, I think, pray about, why isn't the Eucharist changing my life more? And I would say, if you want the Eucharist to transform your life, then say, really strive to prepare each week. And St. Francis de Sales talks about this. He says in the Introduction to Devout Life, even to take days to prepare yourself to receive the Eucharist. Friday is a day of penance, which is meant to prepare us for Sunday, the day of the resurrection. So it's like a mini day of the crucifix for our day of the resurrection each week. So enter into Friday as a great day of spiritual preparation, and then get everything else done that you need to get done on Saturday, so that Sunday is truly the Lord's day. You're giving yourself to Him. You're soaking it in. You're getting to Mass early. You're staying late. You're having a meal with other people, with families. You're really taking advantage of that. So I recommend making a conscious choice to receive the Eucharist whenever you do. Don't take it for granted. Don't make it routine. And I even offer some prayers in the back of the book. Here are prayers that you can pray to prepare yourselves, to really say, Jesus, I want to receive you. Help me to get ready. Help me to receive you fruitfully. Help me to live alongside of you. And then I would say beyond that, then commit to going and praying at least one additional time a week before the Blessed Sacrament. That will be transformative. And try to keep that going. A big part of a Eucharistic life is that you become a tabernacle of Jesus in the world, that Jesus begins to change things in the world through His presence in you. And if you want to keep that presence going, pray every single day. that is, I think, a key open door to the presence of Jesus in your life.
Well, Jared, we'll put links to the book, How the Eucharist Can Save Civilization, as well as your website, buildingcatholicculture.com. We'll put that in the show notes. People see it on the screen if they're watching the video. It was so great catching up with you. I want to keep talking, but I also want to be respectful of your time. It's been way too long. Anytime that we can be of assistance in the work that you're doing, please let us know. Just great catching up with you. And thank you.
Yeah, and vice versa.
Thanks for being on the show with us today.
Absolutely.
So did you ever get a chance? I don't think you ever actually met Jared, but because so much was going on in our lives at the time when he started working in the office. But
yeah, no,
was that the first time you ever spoke to Jared?
Yes, I believe so. There was another gentleman whose name, I think, Ben Akers.
Oh yeah, Ben.
I have a memory of that man, and so it's a little overlap in my brain as to who is who, but I'm pretty sure I've never met Dr. Jared Staudt before this very moment, and I'm so glad we did. I'm so glad. Ben
Akers is a doctor now. He was working on it when we were there. He finally got it, Dr. Ben Akers, and he also has a connection to Augustine Institute. Ben oversees all of their formed content.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned
Ben is a goofball, and I actually traded emails with him a few months ago to have him on the program to talk about formed.
Okay. When at the beginning of the interview, I don't know if you caught this, I definitely did, but Dr. Jared referred to the Augustine Institute as simply AI, and he said, "So when I got involved with AI, and I'm like,
I didn't even think about that.
Let's clarify that to our listeners. It is not. No, I didn't get to because there was no chance for me to jump in. I didn't want to interrupt him, but I'm like, that sounds like he just is now working for artificial intelligence.
Oh no,
he meant Augustine Institute and AI,
and that's common vernacular out there. You're saying, we're going to go to the 12 o'clock mass at AI. I'm going down to meet with so and so down at AI. I'm going to go down to the coffee house at AI.
So that's I wrote it down. It made me chuckle interiorly.
That is funny.
I just wrote AI.
The Augustine.
What is that?
So he was involved in the Archdiocese of Denver and AI, Augustine Institute. It's like, if you're a Catholic out there, you're either working for a parish, or you are working for the Archdiocese, or you're working for the Augustine Institute, or you work in a coffee house. I mean, that's sort of like your options.
The main employers.
We used to joke and say that Denver had the highest per capita number of baristas with theology degrees from Steubenville University, because it was at that point a mecca for a lot of Catholic students. Like, well, let's move out to Denver, and it is. It's really kind of amazing. I always talked about how, when you think about, what was it, 93, when John Paul II was there for World Youth Day. And after 93, all these different apostolates popped up. Augustine Institute and Endow and several other groups out of the Denver area started. And vocations up and all these different things. And meanwhile, it's also one of the first places where the legalization of marijuana, where there's a lot of, the pro-choice side of things is very, very vibrant and alive out there. And just so that basically, wherever God is going to make his presence known, the devil shows up with his army as well and tries to break it down. But there's just been a lot of fruit that has come out of that area. It's been undeniable to see. So anyway.
Well, Greg, I was going to ask you, what was some of your favorite takeaways from this conversation? I know you got a little emotional at one point when you had this realization.
Well, in my head, some of the things I was saying is like, I've already been aware of how much lately more and more time is getting put in between my visits to the confessional. And I mean, not anything terrible. I mean, but it's been 4 or 5 weeks since I went last, and it keeps sneaking up on me. And I also am embarrassed to admit how infrequently I go to adoration these days. But part of it is because I was starting to struggle when I went to adoration. I keep going in and I'm so distracted. I'm so, there's just very stupid reasons, right? But I'm not going because of excuses. And that's not a good enough of a reason not to spend time with Jesus. And part of it is, there was a time where I would go and there wouldn't be anyone in there. And that I relish. And so
but there's that fraternity thing he brought up several times.
Because I get so distracted. Well, but when you go to adoration, you're not in fraternity with anyone. You might be there at the same time, but you're not I don't know. It's different. So I was just reminded of the need to sort of kick things into gear more, and knowing I need to, especially with what we're trying to do with School of Mary and everything else, just really needing to put the effort in a little bit harder than I have in the past. So those things were coming up. I really appreciate the encouragement that, not all is lost, right?
Yeah.
And even though sometimes we get so caught up in just focusing on the Catholic news of the day and even the worldly news of the day, that it's just sort of like you start to get discouraged. And I admit I've been very discouraged in the last few months, just overall. And this was a reminder to me of just how important the Eucharist has been in my life. And it doesn't mean that I think sometimes I feel like I hit the pinnacle of my closeness to the Eucharist, and I feel like I haven't felt it as much. And just because I don't feel it doesn't mean it's not real. But a big part of it that there's basically dryness that's been happening for a while, and I don't know how to overcome that dryness on my own. And I think other than just being persistent, I need to be more persistent in showing up, even though it might be dry for me at that moment. And so those kinds of things, right? And I thought he made a really good point. Again, going back to the idea of more frequent confession, the better prepared you are to receive, the more fully you will receive. And so that idea of constant connection to going to confession, I think about times where confession and regular adoration, holy hours in front of the Eucharist, normally preceded major things in my life. So those kind of things. How about you?
Definitely the question about, am I living as if I were transformed by the Eucharist? It's like, okay, I receive him and I'd really try to be very connected and immersed in that moment at Mass, but I can admit I'm probably compartmentalizing it, keeping it in on a Sunday, and I'm trying to pull it into Monday through Saturday, that encounter, to live inside that encounter. But I realized I'm not doing enough. I'm not. Like you, the time between confession is getting closer to, once a month, which is still not bad. In the Catholic world, that's not bad. But sometimes I'll miss that, and it'll be 5 and 6 weeks. Okay, am I really preparing myself for Jesus, to have that encounter with him? And so that kind of struck me was, am I living transformed? If Christ is in me, I received him, what am I doing to show the change, to make visible the encounter that occurred in me? And suddenly you start getting some interesting answers when you ask yourself really the right questions, and how we can positively impact culture. And yeah, I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. We do live in little bubbles of our own design. We have designed a particular bubble even in our home, and it gets very comfortable in there. And briefly, that notion did come up of how men like to be challenged, but men also like to be comfortable. Well, it's not just men, it's women too. We like our comfort, and we like to be wholly inside of our bubble, in our comfort zone. But how can we go out and be fraternal, be a representative of Christ wherever we are called to be in that world, whether it be through a workplace, going to the store, whatever.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, sure.
So, you and I have talked about this privately and not with any significant seriousness. But while I oftentimes say, I bristle at fraternity, there's certain fraternity that I do like, right? I have, since we've been attending this one particular parish for the last couple of years, and that parish, however, requires, a couple hours of driving on Sunday. I really, truly miss the opportunity to go to sign up as a regular adorer of Eucharistic adoration, and to have the option to go to some event in the middle of the week without, having to drive, and in that time it'd take it over an hour to get there because of traffic. Right on Sunday we can get there in under an hour. I miss being close to a parish that I attend. I miss that very much. I miss the opportunities of when things come up, like a parish retreat or a mission, right, or some other things, I miss the fact that we don't live close enough to actually participate in a lot of those things, so that we could grow in more frequent communities, so that we could make ourselves more available, so that we could sign up for something if something was needed, right? And that tugs at my heart a lot. Not that I want to move again, but that tugs at my heart that I don't see us not going here anytime soon. Even if our priests were to leave, I don't see us stopping going there. Mm-hmm. And so that perplexes me, because I don't have an answer to that. So that also came to my mind a few times when he was talking about seeking out that fraternity and having that fraternity at, it starts at a parish level. And then if we didn't have the thing after Mass on Sundays, I was thinking about some people that we know, right? Like, I'd love to, hey, that we're not doing that thing after Mass today. Why don't y'all come over for breakfast? Well, we can't do that. We live 45, 50 minutes away from the parish. So those kinds of things.
It did make me, I briefly had this flutter of a thought go through my mind when we talked about this, what the church used to represent in society and the establishment of a civilization, how there was a time where the church was the center, a physical center for the community that sprung up around it. And so I'm aware of this, Immaculata Cathedral that got built recently and was...
You're talking about the one in Missouri?
Yes, in St. Mary's, Missouri, where there really isn't hardly anything. It's like a nothing town.
Yeah.
But they got this big, giant cathedral, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see who shows up.
Well, I will say
with
this.
bags packed, I'm like, you know what? We're going to build the community around this church that it exists.
Let me say this. I agree, but I agree there's a reason why I agree. Mm-hmm. And years ago, when we were doing our radio show, one day we talked about an article that I saw somewhere about the best cities to raise Catholic families. And we just posted a link to something on our website for that. To this day, we get hundreds of visitors to gregandjennifer.com from people, hundreds of visitors a month from people who search for that term, best Catholic cities to raise families, or best Catholic towns to raise families. People are out there searching for that community. They want it. And so and even still, a few times a year, I'll get an email from someone saying, hey, do you have an update on that? I'm like, it was a random blog post from 11 years ago, but it's something. I mean, I think about it. I can't imagine up and moving to some place for that. But is that me telling God no, right? Is that not even being open to something like that? So I don't know. We didn't talk about it with Jared, but his willingness to move to a place to have community. It says something. Well, we moved here for community for Mac and Catherine,
right. But we do that. A lot of families will make big moves ultimately for this good purpose that points to God.
So thanks again to Dr. Jared Staudt for being on the program. It gave us a lot of, obviously, food for thought. We can keep talking about it, but we'll let you go so that you can move on with your lives, so that you can go build community wherever you are, with Eucharist at the core of that. Pray your rosary today, folks. If you need help with that, you can go over to rosaryarmy.com. You can download audio prayers and all that kind of stuff. Pray along with us. You can follow our YouTube channel, where we also have an archive of those things. But pray your rosary every single day.
And do whatever it takes to be reverent and holy.
We'll talk to you again in a few days. God bless.